No good news in mail and nothing sold. Carl returns my mother's story. This journal entry dates from June 21st, 1930. Later the same year, Carl Brandt privately advised Lane to give up on Pioneer Girl. He believed it had no future. Carl advises not to try to sell my mother's story, Lane wrote in her diary. Again, we don't know how Wilder reacted to this news, and Lane's diary entries are so short that they reveal nothing about either woman's emotional response to this news. But Lane's diary does reveal that she ignored Carl Brandt's rejection of her mother's story right from the beginning. Just a little over a month after Carl Brandt decided not to represent Pioneer Girl and returned the typewritten manuscript, Rose, and perhaps Wilder herself, was at work on a new draft. At typewriter till 4 p.m., rewriting my mother's story. She says she wants prestige rather than money, Lane wrote. Wilder and Lane had a fairly extensive history of working together collaboratively on editorial projects, as we've discussed earlier. This goes back to 1915, when Wilder visited her daughter in San Francisco. But no record remains to provide specific details about how the two of them worked on these new drafts for Pioneer Girl. Lane's diary isn't revealing either. She includes specific dates and frequently writes that she worked on her mother's copy, but it's unclear what Lane meant by that. Based on extensive editorial correspondence between the two women later in the 1930s, correspondence that we'll examine together in this class, it is clear that Wilder had a definite vision for her work right from the beginning and was actively involved in the editing and rewriting process that came later in the Little House series. Furthermore, her handwritten version of Pioneer Girl reveals that she was an accomplished and thoughtful writer, even in her first attempt to write a book-length project, even when working on a rough draft. So it's very likely that there was give and take between Wilder and Lane as these new revised versions of Pioneer Girl took shape. And two important but very different versions of Pioneer Girl emerged between July 31st and October 1930. Both featured a stronger narrative structure. For example, the version known as the By manuscript included section and scene breaks to give the story more structure and focus. The version also included more adult material and an emphasis on experiences that would resonate with readers of such magazines as the Saturday Evening Post and the Ladies' Home Journal. This was a manuscript about looking back at childhood and adolescence and reflecting on a more simple and yet sometimes dangerous past. Let me give you an example of this striking new adult material. In the early 1870s, the Bender family of southeastern Kansas was accused of mass murder and burying their victims, including a little girl and her father, on their property. The story continued to make headlines into the 1930s. And guess what? On page 7 of the revised By version of Pioneer Girl, the wholesome Ingalls family crosses paths with the notorious Benders. Then Pa said, they found a little girl no bigger than Laura. They'd thrown her in on top of her father and mother and tramped the ground down on them while the little girl was still alive. I screamed, and Ma told Pa he should have known better. Pa took his gun, jumped on Patty, and rode away. The only problem with this episode? When the Bender mass murder story broke and the bodies were discovered in 1873, the Ingalls family was living in Wisconsin, not Kansas. Pa couldn't have taken up his gun to ride with the vigilantes to bring the Benders to justice, unless he decided to ride south across Iowa, Missouri, and then into Kansas. So how did this fictional episode end up in this version of Wilder's autobiography? It's likely that the idea originated with Rose as a kind of marketing strategy. After all, the story appears early in the manuscript where it would quickly gain an editor's attention. And since the Benders were still in the news in 1930, it would make Pioneer Girl itself more sensational, and even relevant. Furthermore, Rose had a track record of fictionalizing her own nonfiction, of making what her biographer calls an easy ethical slide from fact to fiction, when Lane thought it would improve a manuscript's appeal to both editors and readers. But Pioneer Girl was Wilder's autobiography. Surely she bears some responsibility for this. And in 1937, she mentioned the Benders herself in an important speech she delivered at the Detroit Book Fair. We stopped there on our way into the little house in Kansas while Pa watered the horses and brought us all a drink from the well near the door of the house. I saw Kate Bender standing in the doorway. But even this memory is flawed. The Benders weren't in Kansas in 1869 when the Ingalls family first crossed into Indian Territory. So where did this story come from? It's possible that the Ingalls passed by the Benders' property on their way out of Kansas in 1871. Wilder would have been about 4 years old. Perhaps she confused the circumstances of this memory. But certainly she must have agreed with Rose that this episode made Pioneer Girl more memorable, and she was willing to fictionalize a scrap of memory to make her manuscript more marketable. This, by the way, continues to be a contemporary issue and has been the downfall of several best-selling autobiographies. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the semester as well. Now, about that other edited version of Pioneer Girl that emerged between July 31st and October 1930. On August 17th, 1930, Lane wrote that she had worked on and finished my mother's juvenile. What? A juvenile version of Pioneer Girl? Where did that come from? In the process of revising the By version of Pioneer Girl, scenes with a more childlike or juvenile appeal were cut. This was especially true of the section in the original manuscript dealing with Wilder's memories of childhood in the deep woods of Wisconsin.